America's most consumed beverage, more than water. The U.S. imports 22 million bags a year.
Your morning breakfast ritual of coffee or tea might be getting a lot more expensive.
This will be indeed the golden age of America. It's coming back. They manipulated their currencies, subsidized their exports.
We import from about 14 different countries right now, and every single one of them is on the tariff list.
That morning cup of joe is likely going to get more expensive.
So what does this mean for 67% of U.S. adults who depend on that caffeine fix?
All right, let's talk tariffs and coffee, because President Trump's newest round of tariffs could make your morning cup of coffee more expensive.
Brazil, the largest supplier of coffee to the United States, its exports now face a 50% tariff into America.
Imagine waking up one morning reaching for your favorite cup of coffee, only to find out that overnight, the price of your daily caffeine fix has skyrocketed, and it's not just a temporary spike. The very supply chain that keeps America caffeinated has been thrown into chaos. That's exactly what's unfolding right now. A massive shipment of U.S. coffee was rejected overseas, leaving American exporters stunned, workers worried, and millions of coffee lovers bracing for impact. And while Washington scrambles for answers, something far more shocking is happening. Canada has swooped in at lightning speed, securing billion-dollar deals with Europe and Asia that threaten to sideline the U.S. entirely. This isn't just about coffee, it's about a power shift in global trade. One wrong move in Washington has opened the door for Canada to steal America's spot at the table, and the ripple effects could hit your wallet sooner than you think. Because when foreign buyers start turning away from U.S. suppliers, it's not just exporters who suffer, it's every single American who depends on affordable coffee every morning. So how did the world's biggest coffee importer end up in this mess? Why is Trump furious, and why are Canada's trade moves suddenly making headlines across the globe? The answers reveal a story that's bigger, bolder, and more dangerous than anyone expected. Coffee isn't just a drink in America, it's a lifeline. More than 67% of adults rely on it to power through their day, making it the most consumed beverage in the country. Yes, even more than water. The U.S. alone imports over 22 million bags of coffee beans every year, fueling an industry worth more than $340 billion annually. From New York's bustling cafes to small-town diners in Texas, coffee isn't just part of the morning routine, it's woven into the nation's identity. But suddenly, that ritual is under threat. This week, news broke that a massive U.S. coffee shipment, hundreds of containers loaded with beans, was rejected overseas. For American exporters, this was more than a business setback. It was a gut punch that sent shockwaves through an industry that touches nearly every corner of the economy. The rejection didn't come from just one port. It was a chain reaction. Buyers in Europe and Asia, once loyal customers of U.S. coffee shipments, quietly turned their backs. They weren't just rejecting beans, they were rejecting the U.S. itself as a reliable trade partner. And almost immediately, whispers started spreading. Was this the beginning of a much bigger collapse in America's grip on global commodities? For coffee drinkers at home, the consequences are personal. That morning cup of joe, once so cheap and dependable, may soon carry a luxury price tag. A $3 latte could become $5 or even higher in major cities. And while that might sound like a small increase, multiply it by millions of cups every single day, and you're looking at a cost of living crisis brewing right under America's nose. But this wasn't just bad luck. It wasn't a natural disaster or a crop failure that caused foreign buyers to slam the door on American coffee. The rejection was a direct response to political decisions made in Washington. And the man at the center of it all? Donald Trump. At the heart of this crisis is one decision, a decision that Donald Trump believed would make America stronger, but instead may have left the country weaker. Earlier this year, Trump doubled down on his hardline trade agenda, unleashing sweeping tariffs that hit imports from dozens of nations. Coffee, one of the very few products America can't grow at scale, got caught in the crossfire. For decades, coffee entered the U.S. tariff-free, an acknowledgement that it's a crop America simply can't produce in large enough quantities. Aside from small-scale farms in Hawaii and Puerto Rico, the U.S. depends almost entirely on imports from Latin America, Africa, and Asia. But Trump wasn't interested in exceptions. In his push to protect American jobs, he slapped tariffs of up to 25% on imports from Canada, Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, and Vietnam, some of the world's largest coffee suppliers. The White House framed it as a bold step, claiming these tariffs would level the playing field and stop other nations from taking advantage of the U.S. But almost immediately, cracks began to show. Canada, once one of Washington's closest allies and a vital hub for processing imported beans, called the move unjustified and retaliated with $30 billion in counter tariffs, with coffee included on the hit list. What Trump had envisioned as a power play quickly spiraled into a bitter standoff. Suddenly, importers faced soaring costs, roasters were scrambling to find affordable beans, and foreign buyers started questioning whether the U.S. was still a stable trade partner. Here's the irony. Tariffs are supposed to protect domestic industries. But coffee is different. America doesn't have a domestic coffee industry to protect. When America stumbled, Canada didn't hesitate. Within hours of the U.S. shipment being rejected, Canadian exporters swooped in like hawks, securing contracts that would change the balance of power in the global coffee trade. Sources close to the negotiations revealed that buyers in Germany, Japan, and South Korea, three of the most lucrative coffee markets on Earth, were eager to distance themselves from U.S. suppliers after Washington's tariffs. And Canada gave them exactly what they wanted: stability. In record time, Canadian processors finalized multi-year deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. These weren't just small agreements. They were game-changing contracts that ensured Canadian firms would now dominate supply routes that the U.S. once controlled. Here's how it worked. Instead of relying on American ports and roasters, Canada began sourcing beans directly from Brazil, Colombia, and Vietnam, the same countries the U.S. had just alienated. Canadian companies roasted and packaged the coffee at home, then shipped it straight to Europe and Asia, cutting the U.S. out of the equation entirely. For Ottawa, this was a masterstroke. Not only did Canada gain new market share, it also reinforced its image as a trustworthy, rules-based trading partner at a time when Washington was being seen as unpredictable and volatile. Buyers weren't just signing contracts for coffee, they were buying into Canada's reputation for consistency. And the symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. In a single move, Canada transformed from a secondary player into a rising powerhouse in the global coffee market. For American exporters, it was a humiliating blow. For Canada, it was a golden opportunity to cement itself as the new go-to supplier. But the real damage wasn't just happening abroad. The ripple effects were about to slam into the U.S. economy, harder than anyone expected. The rejection of that single U.S. coffee shipment didn't just bruise American pride, it unleashed a chain reaction that hit home in devastating ways. From the West Coast to the Gulf, the fallout spread like wildfire. At the port of Seattle, longshore crews who once worked overtime to load coffee exports suddenly found their hours slashed. Warehouses sat half empty, containers piled up, and trucking companies scrambled to find replacement cargo just to keep their drivers on the road. Down south in Houston, coffee shipments stalled mid-route, leaving roasters in limbo. And in New Orleans, a city that's long served as a hub for coffee trade, equipment sat idle as demand from international buyers dried up almost overnight. The layoffs started quietly, but they spread fast. In Washington state, a major roasting facility employing over 400 workers announced temporary furloughs. In Texas, packaging plants that once shipped steady orders to Asia were forced to cut shifts. And family-owned roasteries in Portland, Denver, and Atlanta reported revenue drops of 15 to 30% in just a single month. But the impact didn't stop with the exporters. For everyday Americans, the pain showed up right where it hurts most: the wallet. Wholesale coffee prices spiked by 14.5% year over year, according to government data. That meant a $3 cup of coffee in your local cafe could soon be $5, or even higher in tourist-heavy cities like New York, Chicago, and San Francisco. The morning fix millions rely on was suddenly becoming a luxury. And coffee shops, already squeezed by inflation and higher rent, were being forced to make tough choices: raise prices and risk losing customers, or absorb the costs and risk closing altogether. Even dairy farmers in Wisconsin and California started sounding alarms, warning that if cafes sold fewer lattes, their milk and cream sales would take a hit too. This wasn't just an economic setback, it was the beginning of a cultural shock. Coffee, the drink that powered America's mornings, study sessions, and late-night shifts, was turning into a symbol of uncertainty. And all the while, U.S. exporters could only watch as their former buyers signed long-term deals with Canadian suppliers. But while workers were losing jobs and Americans were paying more for their daily brew, Canada was just getting started. Ottawa wasn't treating this as a one-time win. It was laying the foundation for something much bigger. What looked like a sudden Canadian victory was actually years in the making. While Washington lurched from one trade war to another, Ottawa was quietly building a reputation as one of the world's most stable and predictable trading partners. Canada invested heavily in its coffee infrastructure long before this crisis. Processing plants in Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal were upgraded to handle larger volumes. Ports like Halifax and Vancouver expanded capacity, anticipating that one day they might play a bigger role in global commodity trade. At the same time, Canadian officials worked behind the scenes, signing onto major trade agreements like the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP, and forging a landmark deal with the European Union. These agreements weren't just paperwork, they were insurance policies. They signaled to buyers in Europe and Asia that Canada could be trusted, even when other suppliers became unpredictable. And when the US slammed the door with sudden tariffs, Canada was ready to swing theirs wide open. Meanwhile, the US was unraveling its own reputation. Buyers saw a country that one month imposed a 25% tariff on Canadian coffee, the next month threatened 45% duties on Mexican beans, and hinted at targeting Brazil and Vietnam soon after. To foreign importers, this wasn't strategy, it was volatility. And in global trade, volatility is poison. Coffee supply chains depend on stability. Farmers plant crops years in advance. Roasters sign multi-year contracts. Shipping schedules are set months ahead. One unpredictable move can destroy margins and force buyers to switch suppliers. That's exactly why buyers from Germany, Japan, and South Korea wasted no time turning to Canada. They weren't just buying coffee beans, they were buying peace of mind, and every deal they signed made it harder for the US to claw its way back. In just a matter of days, Canada had positioned itself as more than a backup option. It was now the preferred supplier. And while Washington struggled to explain how tariffs on a crop it doesn't even produce were supposed to protect American jobs, Ottawa was already locking in contracts that would last for years. The contrast couldn't be sharper. In America, chaos and uncertainty. In Canada, stability and trust. And that difference was about to reshape not just the coffee market, but the entire global trade order. But the ripple effects didn't stop there. Because as Canada rose, something even more surprising was happening across the world's biggest coffee-growing nations. The shockwaves didn't stop at American ports or Canadian boardrooms. They rippled outward, reshaping the very foundations of the global coffee trade. For decades, producers in Brazil, Colombia, Vietnam, and Ethiopia relied on the U.S. as a pillar of their export strategy. America was the safe bet, the buyer that could absorb massive volumes, the partner that could weather storms in the market. But after Trump's tariffs, that confidence began to crack. Suddenly, shipping beans to the U.S. came with risk, unexpected costs, delayed negotiations, and the constant threat of new tariffs dropping out of nowhere. So producers started making a quiet but critical shift, sending their best beans not to the US, but to Canada. Why? Because Canada offered something America no longer could: stability. With its web of international trade agreements, Canada promised farmers and exporters that their crops wouldn't be trapped in political crossfire. The response was immediate. Canadian ports like Vancouver and Halifax ramped up operations, expanding their capacity to handle soaring volumes of coffee. Warehouses invested in new storage facilities. Freight companies even began negotiating dedicated shipping lanes for coffee cargo, ensuring beans from Brazil or Colombia would flow seamlessly into Canadian supply chains and then straight out to Europe and Asia. And it wasn't just about logistics. The perception of Canadian coffee itself began to change. Buyers in Germany, Japan, and South Korea weren't just signing contracts, they were rebranding Canada in their minds as a reliable global hub. Suddenly, the Made in Canada label meant more than geography. It meant trust. Meanwhile, multinational giants were quietly hedging their bets. Companies like Nestlé and JDE Peet's began exploring ways to shift more of their North American sourcing from U.S. facilities to Canadian ones. Not to abandon America entirely, but to reduce risk, to ensure they wouldn't get burned if Washington doubled down on its unpredictable policies. And other nations were watching closely. Australia, with its booming cafe culture and deep trade links to Asia, began studying Canada's playbook. Smaller players like New Zealand and Singapore saw opportunities too, testing ways to carve out niches in specialty coffee by capitalizing on America's mistakes. In other words, this wasn't just a US-Canada rivalry anymore. It was the beginning of a global reshuffling of coffee supply chains, a shift toward a multipolar system where no single country dominates, and where stability matters more than size. And that's where the real danger lies for the US. Once buyers learn they can live without American suppliers, once producers redirect their top-quality beans elsewhere, regaining that trust becomes almost impossible. The longer this trend continues, the more permanent it becomes. But the consequences aren't just economic. Inside the US, the political fallout is beginning to boil over, and it could shake Washington to its core. In Washington, tariffs are often sold as tough bargaining chips, short-term pain for long-term gain. But coffee is different. Unlike steel, cars, or lumber, the US doesn't have a homegrown coffee industry to protect. Aside from small farms in Hawaii and Puerto Rico, America produces less than 1% of the beans it consumes. That means tariffs on coffee don't save American jobs. They simply raise costs for importers, roasters, and ultimately, everyday consumers. And that's where the political danger comes in. Coffee isn't a niche product. It isn't optional. It's part of daily life for 70% of American adults. When prices climb and shelves run empty, people notice, and they get angry. Already, small business owners across the country are speaking out. Independent cafe operators in Des Moines, roasteries in Portland, and shop owners in Phoenix are all sounding the same alarm. Tariffs aren't helping. They're hurting. Workers are losing hours, customers are paying more, and the sense of stability that once defined America's coffee market is evaporating. In swing states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Arizona, where cafe culture thrives, the optics are even worse. Imagine walking into your favorite coffee shop and seeing prices suddenly jump 30%. For voters already stretched thin by inflation, this isn't just an inconvenience. It's a symbol of government failure. Political analysts warn that images of $6 lattes and closed roasteries could become a 2025 campaign issue, especially in battleground states where margins are razor thin. Critics are calling it a self-inflicted wound. Agricultural economists, trade experts, and even some within Trump's own party argue that tariffs on coffee provide no upside, only chaos. Why are we taxing something we don't even grow has become a rallying cry for frustrated importers and cafe owners alike. Meanwhile, Canada is playing its cards with surgical precision. Instead of lashing out with broad retaliatory strikes, Ottawa carefully targeted its counter tariffs to pressure influential American industries while keeping doors open abroad. The result? Canada looks calm and strategic, while Washington looks erratic and impulsive. And in politics, perception is everything. Canada is building brand equity abroad, positioning itself as the steady hand in global trade, while the US risks being seen as unreliable. That image problem could outlast this coffee crisis, shaping how allies and rivals alike view America's role in the global economy. The deeper question is this: if the US can't even manage its position in something as everyday as coffee, what does that say about its leadership in other industries, or even in geopolitics? That doubt is beginning to spread, and once it takes hold, it's hard to reverse. But this story isn't just about politics, it's about the bigger picture. Because coffee may only be the beginning of a much larger power shift in global trade. On the surface, this might look like just another trade spat over coffee beans, but in reality, it's much bigger. What's happening right now could mark the start of a fundamental shift in global trade power, and the US may be the one losing ground. For decades, America wasn't just the world's largest economy, it was the default trade hub. From coffee to steel, from agriculture to technology, buyers around the globe counted on US stability. Contracts were signed with the assumption that America would always deliver. If one supplier failed, America had the infrastructure, the capacity, and the credibility to step in. That assumption kept US companies at the center of countless global supply chains. But the coffee crisis shows just how fragile that reputation has become. In a matter of days, Canada proved that it could step into America's role, quickly, decisively, and effectively. And if Canada can do it in coffee, what's stopping it from doing the same in seafood, lumber, clean energy, or even advanced manufacturing? Already, Canadian trade officials are reportedly exploring ways to leverage this new perception of reliability into broader sectors. In Europe, Ottawa is pushing its role in sustainable energy partnerships. In Asia, Canadian exporters are pitching themselves as an alternative supplier, not just for coffee, but for agriculture and high-tech materials. Every new deal signed in coffee strengthens the narrative. Canada is the partner you can trust when the US becomes unpredictable. And this shift isn't happening in isolation. Other nations are watching closely. Countries like Australia, New Zealand, and Singapore see opportunities to carve out niches by marketing themselves as stable alternatives. Even emerging economies are realizing that in a world where the US plays hardball with tariffs, there's space for new trade hubs to rise. What's unfolding is more than a trade dispute. It's a glimpse of a multipolar world order. Instead of one dominant superpower controlling supply chains, we may be moving toward a network of regional hubs, each trusted for different industries. And if that's the case, the US risks losing not just contracts. What began as a single shipment of coffee rejected at foreign ports has spiraled into something far larger. A moment that could redefine America's role in global trade? In just a matter of days, Canada turned US weakness into its own strength, winning billion-dollar contracts, reshaping supply chains, and positioning itself as the stable alternative buyers now crave. For the US, the fallout is already visible. Rising prices at home, lost jobs in roasteries and ports, and a bitter political debate over tariffs that make no sense for a product America barely produces. But beyond those immediate consequences lies a much bigger threat: the erosion of trust. Because once foreign buyers grow accustomed to living without US suppliers, once producers like Brazil and Vietnam start reserving their best beans for other partners, winning that trust back becomes nearly impossible. And that's why this crisis matters. Coffee is more than a drink, it's a test case. A warning shot, a sign that the balance of economic power can shift not in decades, but in days. If Washington continues down this path, coffee could be just the first domino to fall, followed by seafood, lumber, clean energy, and beyond. One miscalculation after another could chip away at America's global dominance until it's gone. Meanwhile, Canada's message to the world is clear. When the US can't deliver, we will. And every new deal they sign cements that image further. The question now isn't just whether your morning latte will cost $6 instead of $3. It's whether the US can stop this slide before it becomes permanent. Can America reclaim its place at the center of global trade? Or has the torch already passed to others who were quietly waiting for their moment? One rejected shipment has set off a chain reaction that